Hello, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami. Good morning to you. We're almost at the end of May, and we're still here in California, at least, we're still sheltered in place. Looks like we might be loosening up soon, but not yet. So we'll continue these morning broadcasts for as long as our circumstances remain like this, and we'll sort of see what happens after that. So let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Baba J. Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to lift our hearts in joyous self-offering, that everything we do will be in conscious service to you. And help us to feel your loving presence in our hearts, that everything we do is an expression to others of your divine love for all. Om. Peace. Amen. We are working with the way of Ananda Sangis. I don't know what day we're on, it doesn't really matter. There's 7 points in the way of Ananda Sangis in my Light Bearer book. I explained in year 2003, this is Swami's articulation of what it means to be on the path of Ananda in a very beautiful and serious way. So I've been going through it point by point. As I said, there's 7 points, but the second of these points has 6 subpoints. Is it 6? 7 subpoints. I mean, it's not really as complicated. It sounds like a legal document, but all of the points that I've been reading for the last few days are all in support of this idea. We believe that man's highest duty is to realize himself as an expression of all-pervading Satchidananda. That's a very abstract idea, so Swami has grounded it with 7 points, and we're up to the 7th. Yesterday, just by the way, I was talking about how Swami Kriyananda said that Master was so adorable. In the context, I was saying how he didn't exactly know how to put it into a book like The Path or The Essence of Self-Realization, because it was too, I don't know, it was too lighthearted. It didn't fit in the seriousness of describing an avatar. But Swami just talked about how your heart just spontaneously opened to him in a very childlike way, because he was just so charming in his childlike way. After we were off the air, someone reminded me there's a chant that goes, adorable hymn, and not H-Y-M, but we describe God as adorable him. And it's not whimsical when we say it. It's very sort of heartfelt. And I was thinking about that word adorable, what different meanings it has. You know, in the context of that chant, the way it sounds, it's the one that I adore. And the one that I adore can be a very profound expression. You know, I adore you. It's even more than saying I love you. It's a beyond that. And God is the most supremely lovable. So we speak of him as adorable him. But also how the word has another nuance. You know, English is a very rich and complicated language. It's the only language I speak, but since I know many multi-language people, and Swami himself, he would often talk about that you could just do things in English that you can't do in other languages because of the multitude of words and the exactness. But also there's just countless things that are just impossible to know unless you know them, because you can also say, oh, you're so adorable, and it has a completely different meaning. In fact, Swamiji, at a certain point in his life, he became sort of a little bit of a cute old man. And he told us once that he was at, for a period of time, he went to these like New Age conferences that were being given all over the country. The name escaped spirit, and I can't remember what they were called, but there were these New Age conferences around, and Ananda would have a booth, and there would be a wide variety of people there. And he said at that time, Swami used to hug people. Toward the end of his life, he became very disinclined toward having that kind of physical contact with people, but he used to allow himself to be hugged, and he would hug people. And so he was somewhere in the aisle of one of those big conferences, and this woman came up to him and sort of, slightly exaggerated way said, "Oh, there's something I've just always wanted to do. Do you mind?" And he assumed that she was just going to give him a hug, so he accepted in principle what she wanted. She took him by both cheeks like this and said, "You're so adorable." So he just laughed when he told us. He said, there was just nothing to do at that point. But you can understand, the heart, like with a child, the heart, it's only like with children that we allow ourselves to become like that free. You see a little child and you're just, not everyone does, but I'm like that too. I like children, I like babies. My friend, before his first son was born, he absolutely swore he would not be one of those ridiculous fathers who makes a fool out of himself just to get a smile out of his child. He said that resolution lasted into about 1 hour of his baby's life. And then for the rest of his time raising 4 children, he said that he had no dignity whatsoever. Anything that would entertain his children was just fine with him. Because you just want to. Your heart just goes out like that. So in that meaning also, God is adorable because he just wakens within us this spontaneous desire to love. This is the childlike spirit that Jesus meant when he said, "Suffer little children to come unto me." That ones who you just give your heart because you want to. That's also why, in the prayer that Master gave us, he speaks of the classic bhavs of the devotee for God. Father, Father, mother, friend, beloved, servant or disciple to Master. But he doesn't give one that is very, very common in India, but I think he probably just didn't know how to really present it to the West, where the devotee is the mother and God is the child. And it's a wholly different kind of devotion that, when you think about it, can be the most spontaneous, the most free, and the most absolutely unconscious, unself-conscious offering of the heart, is the way that a mother loves a child. You see all mothers and fathers, just kitchy, kitchy, boo, 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 like that. And it doesn't cross your mind. It doesn't cross the mind of the parent that there's anything inappropriate. And it doesn't cross the mind of the parent that the child does not welcome it, which is really the most important line that we're trying to get over, is the sure knowledge that God welcomes this outpouring of affection. In fact, that's what God is waiting for. You have to forgive me because I'm doing a lot of broadcasts and I get real confused about what was said where. Oh, I remember now, this wasn't any of the morning ones. This was my Tuesday night class. That a friend of mine, when he read, or maybe it was the mornings, who cares? A friend of mine, when he read Autobiography of a Yogi, this was Sambhava, and he realized it turned his life around. He realized that it was not only possible for him to seek God, but even more profoundly, God was seeking him. That's how he put it. And I've just loved remembering that. Oh, God is seeking me. And therefore, whatever I pour out, God reads the heart. He knows what I actually mean. The baby's not thinking, "Mother." That's really so undignified. Although, honestly, sometimes I think the children are thinking that. You see like the first grandchild in the family, and they're in a restaurant and there's like 12 adults, and then there's some little, thing on the high chair like this, and all 12 adults spend the entire time, just staring at the child. And I think sometimes the child would say, get a life, for heaven's sakes, like enough already, because it is a lot. I mean, of course, that's not true. I'm only half joking. But the child never thinks that it should be anything other than it is. And, the child doesn't know that mother is overweight or old or doesn't have a good singing voice or has wrinkles on her face. Doesn't know any of those things. It's just the love pours in. And the mother gives it so freely because there's no judgment. Except it's practice. That's why it's one of the classic bhavs for loving God, because that's how we need to be with God. That's how much we need to love God and how freely we need to love God. Because I'm on this, I'm just going to go on for a few more minutes. There's an amazing story in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. In India, even now, but especially in the 1800s when Ramakrishna lived, if a woman was widowed, she was not allowed to remarry, and she had to take up a life of austerity. If she was a Brahmin widow, she had to just take up this very austere life. So there was this woman who lived in a small room, maybe at the support of a wealthy woman, I'm not sure, but it was near the temple where Ramakrishna lived, not at the temple, but near it. And she was called Gopal Ma because her Ishtadeva. Ishta means the chosen form of the deity is what your Ishtadeva is. And her Ishtadeva was Krishna as a baby. In India, all the deities have not only an adult form, but they have a baby form. And there's a little murti, a little statue, and there's another name. There's the baby name. So Gopal is the baby name for Krishna. And so there's all these little statues of baby Gopal, and you can have on your puja table, on your worship table, your picture of the deity is a little child crawling along. Sometimes some of the Gopal statues have a little ball of butter that he's stolen from his mother. And so Gopal Ma, for decades, because she was widowed very young, she took up residence there and she carried out a very strict regimen of austerities and worship of Gopal Ma, of Gopal, the little baby, so much so that her name was Gopal Ma. Then Ramakrishna came there and, she became close with him. And after decades of this worship, one day, Gopal manifested himself to her. Not the statue, but the baby. And not everyone could see the baby, but she could see the baby. And all of a sudden, instead of having this little deity that behaved the way she wanted to do, she had a rambunctious, mischievous, living child, like, maybe 2, which was about the age that Gopal was. And he was crawling all over her. He was upsetting her worship things. He was not cooperating with anything she needed. He was wrecking her little home. He was just wild. And she picks him up and comes running to the temple where Ramakrishna is. And Ramakrishna, of course, has the capacity to enter into the superconscious state that she's in. And they celebrated. And this went on, I believe, for several months, or at least for several weeks, that the absolute devotion. Now, of course, this is a woman who'd been widowed young, so she'd never had children, and of course, having children in the Indian culture, especially at that time, was considered to be the deepest fulfillment a mother could have. So she'd made Gopal her baby. So all of a sudden, in her old age, she gets to be a mother to the Lord himself. She gets to be Yashoda. She gets to be the deity that loves the child. It's an incredible story. If you look it up on the internet, Gopal Ma, the disciple of Ramakrishna, and just how it went and what finally happened. Let's see how it gradually. Now, I don't know if this is sequential, but eventually the baby Gopal disappeared into the form of Ramakrishna. And Gopal Ma saw them as one. And then the visions began to subside. And Ramakrishna sat on her lap like a baby. This is why people thought he was crazy, Ramakrishna, because he's not normal. This woman comes in, she's completely disheveled. She claims that she has a baby, and Ramakrishna relates to her as if it was true and talks about the baby Gopal. And then when she begins to see Ramakrishna's baby Gopal, Ramakrishna responds to her as if he were baby Gopal. treats her like his mother and as if he were a baby. So people of ordinary sight. I mean, there was a constant debate when Ramakrishna was alive as to whether he was a saint or a madman. After it's all over, everybody can say, well, quite authoritatively, well, obviously Jesus was resurrected, of course, obviously Ramakrishna was a great avatar, it's pretty obvious, but when he's there, and that was the same with Master. Master didn't write Autobiography of a Yogi till 1946. So most of the time that he was in America, the first 26 years, people didn't have that book. And he didn't go around saying, oh, by the way, I'm a great soul. I mean, he just never did. He just presented himself as he was and let people decide. And many people decided that he wasn't all that special because it's for those who have eyes to see. One more story about Ramakrishna's life. There was this woman, sadhu, which was not that common. Barfi was her name. Was that her name? Bhairavi. And she was a scholar and a sadhu. She was very unusual for a woman, but she was also a very, very powerful person. I believe she'd been a very high caste person and therefore had the magnetism and the authority to be able to live quite outside of things. It wasn't like unheard of for a woman to be like that. She came to Ramakrishna. She became convinced that he was an avatar, and she convened a conference of scholars. And these were things that would happen in that country at that time. I mean, it's just, what a wonderful country where things like this could happen. She would convene these scholars, and there was a whole process. And then she would present the evidence. She presented the evidence. She was his advocate. He had nothing to do with it. She was his advocate. She had all the scriptural references. She had all the evidence of his life to prove that he was, in fact, an avatar. And Ramakrishna just came and listened to the thing like this. And after it was all decided, the scholars decided that indeed the evidence was convincing, and they decided that he was an avatar. And then Ramakrishna, like a little child, afterwards would say to his disciples, did you hear what they decided? They decided that I'm an avatar. Just like, imagine that. It's just, they're very different. The saints are very different than we think they are because there's no ego. There's no self. Even that which happens around and seemingly to their physical body doesn't happen to them. It just happens. So where anybody else would think, like, how could I go around saying I'm an avatar? I'm an avatar. And you, especially in the heyday of the American renaissance of all this Indian stuff, there was a lot of people who did go around saying things like that. Our favorite was someone who took an ad out in Yoga Journal, which was the communication link at that time among the spiritual communities. I don't know if the magazine is still there. It might still be. And the man took out a full-page ad for his programs with his resume, which included a past life as Lord Rama, and various things like that. I mean, it was written like a resume. And, this is who he is now, and this is who he was. And it was... it was just, Swami loved the human comedy. I mean, it was like, okay, we'll see if this works. It just, who knows? Someone once described what was going on at that time, that Americans were so naive about all of this and were so eager, it's just like, and everybody had read Autobiography of a Yogi. And because Master underplayed his own nature, as Swami said, it made people think that you could just go to India and stand on a street corner and like spread your arms out, and some great saint would touch your chest and turn you into samadhi without any effort on your part at all. So there was a naivete. People were gullible, is the word. And someone said it was the equivalent as if some villager had come from India and was staying in someone's house, and on late night television sees a car salesman say, you got to rush right down to Fred's Ford because the last of the cars are here and this is your last chance to get the bargain. And the poor villager wakes up the whole family to rush down to Fred's Ford to get the last one because, we would know, you take it in context. But Americans, we were just like this. It was something to remember. However, one of the wise rabbis at the time when the Jews were really persecuting the Christians, which was a tough time for everybody because Christianity was Judaism. Jesus was a rabbi, and all his disciples, Jesus himself and all his disciples were Jews, virtually all, every one, because that was the spiritual that was the spiritual population. Everybody else was pagan. They just didn't have an understanding of that Judaism had been corrupted by that point by money and power, by a corrupt priesthood. But Judaism was a true faith, and there was a very strong remnant among the Essenes of true Jews. And if you were a serious spiritual person, that's who you were in that population. But Jesus was proclaimed by his followers to be the Messiah, which was an integral part of Orthodox Judaism, that the Messiah was going to come. So the issue was not whether there could be a Messiah. The issue was whether Jesus was that Messiah. And, it became, and a lot of people had a stake in making sure that he wasn't, because he was crucified. They killed him, for heaven's sakes, and rather than, the power structure executed him rather than elevating him. So they had to they had to justify their own actions, or else they were really going to be in a tough spot. And also, he did not fulfill the expectations of the established power structure, because they were in charge, after all, of the whole thing. And if there was going to be a Messiah, he was darn well going to look like them, and he was going to behave like them, and he was going to affirm the reality that they had established. And Jesus absolutely repudiated it. So, just on the face of it, he had to be not the Messiah. How could he be? Because he doesn't match me. Many different times when I've been talking about Swami in my many years with him, I talked about how, being unable to comprehend who he really was, I just made him a little more like me, because that made more sense. And it was, I didn't do that on purpose. I just did it because I didn't know any better. You just can only go a certain distance, and then you have to grow before you can know more. It was primarily in the question of suppression versus transcendence of sorrow. That's really the single area that I want to say, that I don't want to exaggerate it. I didn't understand the difference between suppression and transcendence, and I projected my ignorance on him for a number of years until I grew past it. But so anyway, now let me just try to follow why I'm even talking about this, but I know there's a good reason. Oh yes, this is what it was. Um, so when Jesus died, his disciples thought they had they thought they had the fulfillment of Judaism. So they began to preach to their own people. They began to travel around to the various synagogues and tell them, here's the good news. The Messiah that we've been waiting for, the Messiah that's been prophesied, he's here. This is him. And this is what he taught. And then he died and he was resurrected. And it's a good story. It's a really good story. But so they're going into these established churches. You can picture it now. What if, we don't happen to have, what if a small group of people decided that Jesus had been reborn and the second coming of Christ was now, and then went around to the Methodists and the Protestants and the Congregationalists, and then went to the Pope and said, this one over here, this is the reincarnation of Jesus, or this is Jesus' second coming. They wouldn't necessarily say, hallelujah, praise the Lord. And in fact, after a while, it could become quite annoying, especially if that message had power. And then if that was true, then of course, the people in charge would have to surrender to that higher authority. So the disciples were just traveling around among the Jews, trying to get them to accept this new understanding. It was as I said, it was all Judaism. There was no question of Christianity. But gradually, the existing structure hardened against them, just hardened against them, and saw them not as bringing the good news, but bringing this heretical, undermining, false teaching. And then the power structure began to persecute the disciples. which is why Jesus cleared the decks a little before that time, because he knew they had to be strong. Eventually, I believe it's true, almost all of them were martyred. I mean, that's how intense the feeling was. And Paul, whose name was Saul at that time, was one of the chief persecutors of the Christians, was on the way. I mean, they were executing Christians by that point. And Paul was on the road to Damascus, and he was struck blind for 3 days, and he had a vision of Jesus. And Jesus said, "Why are you doing this to me?" And he fell down as Saul, and he rose up as Paul. And Paul then became the chief advocate. But in all of this, and this is the only point of why I'm saying it, in the Bible, there was a Rabbi Gamaliel, or a name similar to that. And there's a council of rabbis, and they're talking about the necessity to be absolutely brutal to this heretical sect of Judaism that just has to be wiped out for the good of everyone. You know, killing their leader didn't seem to do it. Now they have this preposterous story about him being resurrected when they really just stole his body and hid it somewhere. I mean, you can start, the expression is, once you set a false premise that the earth, this was from William James, that the earth rests on the back of a giant turtle. And then you say, well, what does that turtle rest on? Well, on the back of another turtle, and that turtle on the back of another turtle, until it becomes, as they say, turtles all the way down. So that's sort of a philosophical, it's a phrase at Ananda, I don't know if it's widespread others, that once you just start with a premise, it's just turtles all the way down. You just keep making an answer that fits what your premise is. So Jesus couldn't have been the Messiah. He couldn't have been resurrected. The miracles were all faked. You know, it just goes on and on. But this rabbi said, he says, why don't we just do nothing? He said, why do we have to fight against this? He said, if it is not of God, it will fade away because of the falseness of their own teaching. And if it is of God, he said, woe be unto him who stands against it. So, you know, there was one rabbi who just saw it completely different. What difference does it make? We don't have any responsibility here. The power of God will take care of these things. But he was overruled. But it's in the Bible there. And it's very comforting to realize that, because history, you see, gets written by the victor. So whoever triumphs gets to keep editing the books until it's turtles all the way down. And believe me, they really edit the books. For example, 18 years of Jesus's life is just zip out of the Bible. Even though more and more it's accepted, what Yogananda said is that Jesus went to India for those 18 years. People now, just even in rather orthodox circles, even talk about it. But so when we would see, and I'm going back to the yoga journal where this man had written this resume, which was just charming. It was adorable in its folly. There's no need to stand against it. There's no even need to have an opinion. If it's not of God, it will fade of its own lack of magnetism. And if it is of God, let us not be the ones to stand against it. Which is a very, powerful way to avoid religious bigotry. I'm not saying there's never a time to act. Jesus himself drove the money changers out of the temple. So it's not like you just quietly allow any aberration to go forward. There are times when you do have to stand up. But still, inside our hearts, we have to be conscious of what is our responsibility and what is not our responsibility. So anyway, I've spent the entire time, and I have never dealt with the 7th point of a way of Ananda Sangis. So we'll have to call this class a brief holiday from the subject. And I hope you haven't minded. God bless you.